Good evening, good afternoon. And today we have very important and very interesting topic. Not many people are covering this. And you find several articles. You might have seen that why the role of ESG in M&A transaction. So this is the topic, and we have a speaker, and we are going to ask several questions to him. And welcome, Konrad.
Welcome. Hello.
And I will surely like you to introduce to our audience.
So my name is Konrad Deiters. I'm German. I'm based in the south of Germany, in Bavaria, close to Munich. I'm in M&A since 2007, and I've seen a lot of evolutions in that during that time. And my current role in Mercer is leading globally Mercer's M&A commercial side of the business, which gets me, more and more also engaged with ESG topics. Our today's discussion, right?
Yeah, good. So, while I was looking at several articles and I was reading some of the good reports, and now I see that, ESG is not just a mandate, but it is time to turn ESG theory into action. So it is no more just a leadership talk or boardroom meeting where we just say that we have to follow ESG. But now if I look at, it is really making lots of sense, and it is not just a checkbox or ticking box. It's about making a difference for your business and for our world. And that's how I see that a meaningful change, and really it had to be a measurable value. And that's how many, companies, most of the companies are considering ESG very seriously in their M&A transaction. And that's how I would like to have my first question to you. And my question is more about, can you describe the role of ESG in a company during M&A strategy?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I think that's a good starting point. When we look at transactions, what are companies doing? They are assessing the strategic fit and financial profile, which remains still the most important factor driving a company's M&A strategy. However, the ESG rationale can be thought of as one sub-element of all of that, albeit increasingly important component of assessing the strategic fit. In some transactions, improving a company's ESG profile may be the primary driver, however, behind the strategic rationale of the transaction. In other deals, ESG may play a minor role if the impact on the deal is going to be neutral. In the current environment, however, as companies evaluate a potential deal, they are more likely to consider the transaction's effects on their carbon footprint, supply chains, and social impact, and to incorporate assumptions about those factors into their valuation. Where a company is evaluating a target with a different ESG profile than its own, positive differences in ESG footprints and disclosure practices may be a source of synergies. In other situations, drastic differences in a buyer and target's ESG profile can even stop a transaction. So that would be my perspective on your question.
Yeah, so I think this is important, and as you described, this role of ESG is so critical for M&A transaction. So just connected to this, my next question will be primarily, what is the role of ESG in the deal process, and why it has risen to, prominence?
Yeah. That happened over the last couple of years, right? Environmental, social, and governance, ESG themes have risen in prominence over the past, I would say 5 years or so, from the growing efforts worldwide to tackle climate change, which is driving everything in that space, to high-profile concerns such as the Black Lives Matter campaign, just to use an example. Societies are increasingly determined to confront a broad range of issues, among others, E, S, and G issues. Business are really expected now to show their colors in these fights, right? And I call them fights, not aggressively speaking, but it's really, and probably also fight against climate change, right? Which we have to go through. So even before the COVID-19 crisis, the ESG investment movement showed strong momentum. Many analysts, however, believe the pandemic has turbocharged the focus on ESG, forcing people to think about the way they live and to confront the interconnectedness of society. As such, most organizations say ESG is important to their organization and say related issues are an important consideration when looking at M&A and other investment opportunities. While many deal makers, in our perspective, recognize the investment case for applying an ESG lens to their business and its transactions, it is certainly also true that regulations, we didn't talk about regulations as yet, there is regulations in place, is forcing deal makers to think hard about ESG, from increasing demands for reporting on issues such as the impact to new laws in many jurisdictions on diversity and inclusion. So this trend of increased regulations is only going to go away unless companies manage to adapt to the changing regulatory climate and so on. So a lot of pressures from regulators and politicians.
Right. So I think, just connected to this, realize that, for this, ESG due diligence will be very important. And can you tell me why it is so important?
Yeah, so again, we talked about the pressure companies are already under and they will have to face in future. It's not a new phenomenon that ESG issues are becoming more prominent, and they are out there for decision making. So from a credential perspective, the credentials perspective, it really is going to be increasingly relevant to also show their dealings, their governance, and their actually status from an ESG perspective in a due diligence. If you look at shareholders, for instance, right, there is this kind of shareholder activism happening, and they are focused on, if you are the owner of, or actually the CEO or the board of a publicly listed organization, shareholder activists might focus on environmental and social issues. We see that already happening. It's on the rise. Consequently, assessing an organization's ESG performance and identifying current and potential risks and opportunities is an important step in ensuring you are making well-informed investments and strategic decisions. On the other hand side, we see the financing spectrum, stakeholders in the banks, right, that would fund transactions. We expect that financiers may specifically require purchasers to have conducted ESG due diligence before providing financing. Similarly, insurance companies, they have this W&I, warranty and indemnity insurance, for transactions. They will also ask for the results of an ESG due diligence. So that's why I think due diligence is important.
So how companies are screening for ESG consideration when they are looking at potential acquisition targets?
Yeah. Now we go a little bit. You take it a little bit further down.
Right.
So it's it's whenever you start at looking at potential acquisition, and ESG is part of the strategy, as we discussed beforehand, it's important to understand the differences between you as a buyer and the seller, right? Because that, if there is differences in ESG profiles, that often cuts to the heart of the social and cultural norms of the organizations, right? We talk about culture probably a little bit later, if we may. And those norms have always been essential to successful M&A, right? When companies acquire targets, and I'm not talking about culture as the norm here, but in a broader sense, how the organization is operating its ESG kind of strategy. When companies acquire targets with a meaningful different ESG profile, it can create cultural tensions between the employee bases and broader stakeholder communities, as we discussed beforehand. It is critical then that integration strategies contemplate what the pro forma ESG profile of the combined business will be and the effect that profile is likely to have on the target's stakeholders, right? At minimum, you have to be philosophically aligned. But again, that's a little bit fluffy. It needs to be really factored in, similarly to kind of risk and cyber risk analysis. And again, we see a growing prominence over the course of the transaction. So the issues that we see is that, whenever you do due diligence, there is no kind of standardized kind of approach to ESG management. And it's unlike organizations, which may rely on ESG scores, the global rating agencies. A merger partner is usually going to be involved in a deeper level due diligence. So again, many organizations are relying on available scores, right, issued by the global rating agencies. But again, whenever you do due diligence, you have to do a deeper dive into the targets, disclosures, and practices. There is you can do a lot of, if a company is listed, desktop due diligence, if you like, but you have to go really in deeper down to get to a more reliable, disclosure opportunity that provides more details than the public due diligence, right? An important way ESG disclosures influence M&A may be through their impact on relative valuations of those companies with ESG-friendly profiles and best-in-class disclosures, right, that are available. We are already seeing that cost of capital or financing for companies with better ESGs, can be lower than the cost of capital for companies with poor ESG rates. However, it's important to do this deeper drill down and not only rely on the publicly available information and that of the rating agencies.
So I think you spoke about how ESG and culture in general, but how do you gauge culture compatibility with ESG scores? How will you be able to do that? Because you spoke about in general, but I'd like to ask you especially, how do you get this cultural compatibility of two company with your ESG scores?
So culture is, and as a Mercer organization, we work frequently on cultural integration projects. But again, if we look at ESG, this is kind of, I wouldn't say it's a subset, but it's an expression of the company's philosophy, organizational strategy, philosophy, and culture as to how they look at the environmental, social, and governmental issues, right? And I actually like very much a study that Doug Moran issued in 2017, where he talks about the culture cohesion between acquirers and targets. And he likes it in particularly in the context of predicting M&A success because of a growing body at that time of evidence that suggests that the firm culture matters more in M&A deals than previously believed. Breaking it down to ESG, right? A company's broad positioning on ESG issues, including policies, programs to manage its environmental and social impacts, human capital development, and progressive governance measures. So it covers the people equation, but also the broader governance topic. They can be used as an insightful proxy for firm culture, right? And now we get to the broader culture again. ESG analysis may not capture all aspects of a company culture, as I stated before, but in their view, it is an increasingly revealing reflection of company norms, especially among mega and large cap equities where ESG programs are prominent. So in their study, they say in case you're gonna measure based on certain scores, issued by the rating agency, if the companies differ plus or minus 5 points of the individual rating scores, used by the agencies, they can actually already kind of draw conclusions that the organization's cultures must be different from an ESG perspective, right? And that gets us into probably value creation or value destruction if ESG is part of their M&A strategy.
Right. Yeah, it's a great point. And now moving forward, what are some of the challenges in making ESG assessment in M&A transaction? What you see, in your experience, what are the key challenges you find?
Yeah, I can give you.
So my question is, what are some of the challenges in making an ESG assessment in M&A transaction?
Yeah, so it's actually the lack of existing standards and criteria being used. You probably always have to use an external, consultancy who constantly are doing this kind of work, and Mercer does that in collaboration with Oliver Wyman and Marsh. We do have a set, but there is others who are doing that as well. We kind of bring the standards, but again, within each and every company, it's kind of different. It's always related to the external stakeholder perspective, to the rating, in order to actually get to a better cost of capital. But this is kind of it inefficient in the beginning, but again, if you have kind of a standard set of questions, then you get to it. So it's let me give you an example. A company that may choose between a number of voluntary labor standards, they may also be required to comply with state and federal level requirements in addition to requirements imposed on it by its major customers. So you have many different stakeholders here. Customers is one. It's certainly politicians, regulations, and certainly employees. We talk about that later. So what is more important? And again, this is also driving a little bit of confusion and inconsistency in standards, right? Because so many different stakeholders are moving in different directions. So, given the increasing public attention to ESG factors and the emerging structure of requirements and guidelines surrounding the relationship between a company and ESG considerations, it seems at the moment impossible to predict as to how ESG considerations will be managed 5 or 10 years from now. So again, it needs to be put in focus. ideally have kind of a standardized way of evaluating and evaluating and evaluating ESG results. But again, there's going to be an evolution over the next 5 to 10 years from now.
Okay, good. I think that makes sense because we have a framework, and I think, as you rightly said, Mercer and some other companies are doing that. I think that is a good way to see the performance and outcomes. So now my next question will be primarily, how do you align M&A and ESG strategy?
Yeah. So successful companies develop an M&A strategy focused on business objectives in the first instance. Right. As a company develops their own ESG strategy, or did develop their strategy already as part of broader objectives, it would likely focus on ESG considerations for its M&A strategy as well, right? For example, for an industrial company that would like to transition to new technologies, which is happening very frequently, looking at digitization, you're also one of the kind of disruptors in the field, right? That will help to reduce CO2 emissions or develop cleaner processes because of technology, right? It will likely look to acquire businesses, this organization in this area. Similarly, a company may decide to sell certain business lines because they are no longer aligned with its strategy. Companies should start with developing an ESG strategy and see how M&A can help to achieve ESG goals, right? So again, this is the connection, and back to your question. A separate issue, however, a buyer should generally assess key ESG risks and opportunities in the target business in a transaction. As we said, even a technology company might have probably a little bit weaker kind of appearance on the ESG side. So this assessment should be evaluated, as we discussed beforehand, against policies, governance, and whatever. But we're going to talk about the details later.
Right. So I got it. So primarily, you say that M&A strategy and ESG strategies should work hand in hand. It should be embedded within your M&A strategy. Okay. So now my next question is primarily like, what are some of the key factors to be considered for ESG due diligence?
Yeah. So again, as in each and every due diligence, in the early stage, and certainly also in the later phase of, probably let's call it confirmatory due diligence, risks, liabilities, and opportunities have to be evaluated, across the ESG spectrum. This kind of entails the benchmark of a company, benchmarking, I should better say, of the company's ESG policies, procedures, and performance against peers and the sector, right? And also kind of look at best practices, because this gives you then, not the baseline, but the upper quarter. The assessment of compliance with national regulations and international treaties is very, very important, because in order to avoid risks, right? In that context, probably not only financial risks, but also revenue risks. Think about the customers. They wouldn't buy any more products from you, from a business to business, but and also business to consumer perspective. So the next topic is into how the company's ESG performance could affect its most valuable intangible assets, including reputation, brand value, trust, and relationships, right? That gets us into the customer as well as employee workforce space. And again, you issued actually yesterday quite interesting message on LinkedIn that the can you again say the did you know message where you stated that over the next years millennials will be the predominant part of the workforce, and they decide as to whether they join a company also based on criterias, and ESG is going to be one of them, right? So that gets you into an assessment of that. Estimates, to mention another topic, estimates of how potential liabilities could affect cost, cash flow, and the deal timeline, right? That's also an important factor to be examined, and recommendations on adjustments to the valuation. And we have seen, bigger adjustments to valuations than I personally would have expected. Millions and millions, if the due diligence reveals differences and issues in those areas.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think I will ask more question. One more question towards, if you could cite some of the example which you have here on tactics, how company are trying to improve their ESG matrices.
Yeah. So let's start with the top ESG performance areas that are being reviewed. It's the strategy, it's the governance, it's risk management, how ESG factors are integrated into the transaction review process, supply chain management, financial and non-financial risk analysis, and finally, metrics and targets. How performance against ESG metrics and targets is tracked in the organization you're looking at. So those 4 areas form the basis for the ESG metrics, right, discussion. And let's talk about the stakeholders who will be interested in ESG performance evaluation. The banks, we talked about them. In addition to ethical considerations and financial opportunities, the unrivaled position that they are to set standards and influence ESG. So the banks really have, next to the regulators, a big say in that area from an ESG consideration, and probably are a key force to drive ESG reporting going forward from a lending and financing perspective. They are really able to shape the way ESG is being analyzed, right, next to the rating agencies.
Next to the rating agency, yeah.
So this is, and we talked about insurances. I wouldn't put them at the top of the house. They play also a role, but I would say a minor role. Right?
Yeah. So now my last question. I know there are in my list there are no more questions, but I'd like to ask my last question. So what has been your experience on evaluation of ESG, and where do you see the top challenges?
Yeah. So creating an evaluation is challenging. It's a challenging piece of work, right? There are no uniform requirements for from a reporting perspective, looking at ESG information, and many environmental and social impacts are hard to measure, right? And it's always whenever you look at the social part where we get engaged, but also the E is probably easier to quantify, right?
Yeah.
And the governance probably also, but it's less easier than the E side, right? But when it comes down to social, we talked about culture. We have a very sophisticated approach to measure the S of an organization. But again, it comes down to the comparison to what you're doing. How well are you as a potential buyer informed about your own processes and governance and operating model and what have you? So again, there are no uniform requirements for reporting, as I said. And from that perspective, the data inputs that we start with are fundamentally less structured, less complete, and of lower quality than financial data, right? You get easily, or probably sometimes not that easily, financial data, which companies are required to present in a standardized form and have it audited by consultants. But again, if you as an organization have a consultant that has kind of a framework around ESG, what is the standard due diligence request list, which questions can be put in a virtual data room, right? Gathering, and you know what I'm talking about, gathering the required information. Probably we see a lot happening then after, I wouldn't say having failed in uploading the relevant information, but that we see virtual meetings happening, discussing actually the current status and the way they operate from a targets perspective, or vice versa. If you divest, you probably also will get questions in that area that will be discussed verbally and documented in the aftermath. It's kind of still a little bit cumbersome, but it's doable in the end. A lot of exchange and communication will be required to get to a fully consolidated view and perspective on the ESG standards, in place.
Right. Yeah. So I think very good summary for, you gave. I think it is overall, if you look in a nutshell, I can assure you that most of the company have ESG in their, mandate for all the deals they are doing. It is not just a action point, but real implementation, which company are focusing and aligning their M&A strategy to ESG strategy. And these are the key things to do. What we are going to do is, because we have time constraint, we'll stop our conversation here and we'll meet and we'll invite you again for another next session related to this area, which is very important and very critical for success of the deal.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for your time. And thank you, audience, for listening.
Very welcome.